Welcome back to our Database Design and Development unit. In today's lesson we'll have moved on to the design stage and we'll be looking at entity occurrence diagrams. Our learning intentions for today are as follows. We'll learn the three relationships that can exist between entities. We'll learn how to identify cardinality by creating an entity occurrence diagram. As always, we have some success criteria, and for today's lesson it is as follows. We'll be able to identify the cardinality of a relationship by creating an entity occurrence diagram. We'll be able to name a relationship between two entities. Before we start looking at our entity occurrence diagrams, let's look at some terminology. Let's look at the term entity. An entity is a person, place, thing or event about which data is to be stored. A good example might look at a school, where possible entities might be a student, a teacher, a class or a subject. When discussing entities, we have entity instances or entity occurrences. These are the same thing. For example, John Smith, Mary McLeod, Omar Shahid are all entity occurrences found in the student entity. They're all examples of students. Further examples would include English, computing and chemistry are all entity occurrences within the subject entity. We'll now look at our first type of relationship, a one-to-one relationship. In this type of relationship, each entity occurrence in an entity is associated with one and only one entity occurrence within a related entity. For example, a school is managed by one and only one head teacher, with a head teacher managing one and only one school. We can see this in our example. Greif High School is managed by Mr. Christie, who is the head teacher. Castle Head, Glenifer High School and Johnson High School all have different occurrences of the head teacher entity. We can use this entity occurrence diagram to identify or prove the cardinality that exists between two entities. In this case, we have our schools and head teachers. We have our four occurrences of the head teacher entity, Mr. Christie, Mr. Menzies, Mrs. Chalmers and Mrs. O'Malley. And we have our four occurrences of the school entity, Greif High School, Castle Head High School, Glenifer High School and Johnson High School. We can now see two entities, school and head teacher, which are represented by ovals. Inside those ovals we can see four instances or occurrences of the school entity, Greif High School, Castle Head, Glenifer and Johnson High School. And in the head teacher entity we have four occurrences of our head teachers, Mr. Christie, Mr. Menzies, Mrs. Chalmers and Mrs. O'Malley. We can now establish those relationships between an occurrence of the school entity and an occurrence of the head teacher entity. This is denoted by a line. In this case, we see that Greif High School has a direct relationship with Mr. Christie as its head teacher. Castle Head with Mr. Menzies, Glenifer with Mrs. Chalmers and Johnson with Mrs. O'Malley. we can now see direct one-to-one relationships. Each occurrence of our school entity matches one and only one occurrence of our head teacher entity. Each occurrence of the head teacher entity matches one and only one of the occurrence of the school entity. Each school is managed by one head teacher, and one head teacher manages one and only one school. Another example would be football teams and managers. We have our team entity, our manager entity. Again, we have 4 occurrences of our team entity: Manchester City, Manchester United, Liverpool and Arsenal, and 4 occurrences of our manager entity: Pep Guardiola, Ruben Amorim, Arne Slot and Mikel Arteta. Again, these have a one-to-one relationship. Each football team or club is coached by or managed by one manager or coach. We'll now look at our second type of relationship, a one-to-many relationship. In this type of relationship, each entity occurrence in an entity can be associated with one or more entity occurrences in a related entity. For example, a school employs many teachers, and each of those teachers is employed by one school. Now again, we have our 2 entities, school and teacher, represented by our ovals. And we take each instance of our teacher entity into the entity oval. There is no repeating data there. So we have Mr. McKinnon, Mr. Evans, Mr. Hardy, Miss McNally, Miss Dowd, Mr. Locke and Mr. McGivern. For the school entity and its occurrences, we have repeating data here. Now it's important to note that we only want to show one instance of those school entities. So where we have repeating data, we only show this once. In other words, we only have 4 unique school entity occurrences. We enter each of those unique entity occurrences into the entity occurrence diagram. So we show Greif once, Castlehead once, Glenifer once, and Johnston once. We are then able to establish those relationships, and we can see that Greif High School here has 2 teachers associated with it, Mr. McKinnon and Mr. Evans. Castlehead having 2, Glenifer having 2, and Johnston having 1. Really important to note that we only need one of the occurrences of the school entity to have multiple relationships for it to be a one-to-many relationship between the entities. So in other words, if only one of those school entities, for example Greif High School, had multiple relationships, then the relationship between the school and teacher entity would still be a one-to-many, even though the other occurrences at Castlehead, Glenifer and Johnston only had 1. This shows that each school employs many teachers. Another good example would be doctors and patients. We can see that Dr. Johnson has 3 patients associated with him. Dr. Reed has 1, Dr. Love has 2, and Professor Joyce has 1. Again, each doctor treats many patients. Our final relationship will be a many-to-many relationship, and that's where several entity occurrences in an entity can be associated with multiple entity occurrences in a related entity. For example, we have many students study several different subjects, and each of those subjects is studied by many students. We again take this to our entities, student and subject. We have repeating data now in both entities. We have repeating occurrences. We have 3 unique subject entity occurrences: higher computing, N5 business, and higher maths. Whereas we have 4 unique student entity occurrences: Joseph Smith, Jodie Brown, Ryan Sweeney, and Kelly Gibson. Now, when establishing these relationships, we can see that Joseph Smith studies 1 subject, higher computing. Jodie Brown, on the other hand, studies 3 subjects, higher computing, N5 business, and higher maths. Ryan Sweeney studies higher computing, and Kelly Gibson studies higher computing and N5 business. Looking at this the other way, we can see that higher computing is associated with 4 different students. We can see that N5 business is studied by 2 different students, and higher maths with 1. We can see that many students study many subjects, and each subject is studied by many students. Another good example would be diner and dish. We have our 4 instances of our diners and 4 different dishes on offer. Jarvis is looking at having some spaghetti and garlic bread, whereas Kelly is having spaghetti and pizza. Rachel is just having some steak, whereas Martin is having some pizza and garlic bread. Again, we can see that our diners are having possibly multiple dishes, but those dishes are being eaten by multiple diners. Each diner can order many dishes, and those dishes can be ordered by many diners. Thank you for viewing this lesson on our YouTube channel. Please follow and subscribe for more content.